You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Hey, Power Athlete Nation. I have a riveting podcast for you today with Mr. Alexander Hutchison, who wrote a book called In Defense of Doping, Reassessing the Level Playing Field. We get into a interesting conversation with a lot of twists and turns and looking at performance enhancing from when it first started, with the Greeks and the Romans eating, high protein diets and, supplementing with wine before matches, all the way through, East Germany for the first systematic countrywide performance enhancing system to go out and, make East European women swimmers the best. And then all of a sudden, all the way through professional sports and, the baseball era, and really what we got down into a lot with Lance Armstrong and the doping scandal for the Tour de France. So really fascinating discussion looking at, not only has performance enhancing been a part of sports for as long as people have been competing at them, but also if there's a time now for having a level playing field and really just deciding whether or not these drugs really cause performance enhancing and if they have a place, and really if it even makes sense to test people instead of just educating them and finding a more level playing ground. So I want you to buckle up for a riveting conversation. Dr. Alexander Hutchison. I'd actually like to talk about the book a bunch. I think it's a really interesting proposition, about leveling the playing field and effectively, performance enhancing, like you get into the book, has been something that's existed for so long. Why not just make it all legal and at least level the playing field so you have instead of having the haves and the have-nots?
That's part of my philosophy for sure. There's certain things out there. I mean, it's akin to what we would do with narcotics. There's some drugs, namely marijuana, that I think should just be legalized. There's no reason to have it not be, as far as I can see. But there are other drugs, amphetamines in particular, crank, ice, crack. Those ones probably should not ever be legalized in that fashion, because the people who, the way that those impact the brain is entirely different than what you would see with marijuana. The same thing applies to performance enhancing drugs. There's some obvious ones there that should just be taken off the list. And then there's some other ones, we just don't know the long-term ramifications of taking them at all. There's a lot of drugs out there that are not FDA approved yet. So they haven't even gone through the entire, stage 4 of testing to know how they would behave in the human body. Those kinds of things, at least for the time being, they should be held out. So it shouldn't be just an all-out free-for-all necessarily, but certainly there need to be modifications to the way that we're currently adjudicating this system.
Well, if something's passed through the FDA, and it's been, let's say, approved in some form for human, use, where, the FDA anoints it, there's a case to be like, well, it's approved here, but now all of a sudden it's not approved here.
Yeah, that's right. And so, so you see something, well, it's not quite the same, but HGH would be the best example. There's basically 3 conditions in the United States that you have to have in order for you to get HGH prescribed to legally. And no athlete is going to have any one of these 3 conditions.
What are the 3 conditions?
So the primary one is wasting. So you usually see this. This was particularly within HIV/AIDS patients. Not so much anymore, because the drug cocktails that they're using these days are not nearly as awful as they used to be. Mm-hmm. So we don't get the same level of the redistribution of fat from facial areas to more central adiposity. And then, HIV itself will cause muscle wasting if you actually get to the point where you have AIDS. But in the 90s all the way through the aughts, most of the drugs that you would take would cause some level of muscle wasting. And so they would allow you to take HGH to bring back that muscle tissue. Muscle mass in general is a great predictor of longevity. Sure. If you have good, healthy muscle mass, you're going to live quite a bit longer than most other individuals. And if it starts to waste away, then, you have a lot of secondary ramifications to that. Namely, when we think of elderly individuals, they're simply just weaker. And so they lose a lot of their type 2 muscle fibers, which makes it so that if you stumble, you can't catch yourself very quickly. You'll tip over, break a hip. But beyond that, even if you get there's a lot of respiratory infections, particularly like influenza, And for whatever reason, we're not entirely sure why, but one of the places that influenza likes to go is into skeletal muscle. One of the things that we think may be happening there is that inflammation, that we get recruitment of white blood cells into the area that start to break down the muscle tissue and provide fuel effectively for the virus to be able to replicate within other cells. But why that is the case, we still don't know. So if you have a large reservoir of muscle tissue, then your ability to fight off the flu is significantly higher than if you're frail. So, we can see this all the way through. Then most of the stuff revolves around that. Burn patients is another one that would be allowed to get HGH prescribed to them during the time that they're actually going through their treatment of skin grafts. And then the third one, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but it's obscure.
I think it's abnormal growth.
It's actually
abnormal growth in children.
So that is one. And then the third one. So that's another one. And again, that doesn't happen very often. And it doesn't even have to be in children. It can be within adults too. So if you have people with some levels of dwarfism, they're allowed to take it as well. The other one is if you have IBD or gut issues. So HGH, interestingly enough, allows you to heal up a lot of the damage that is caused by, which are actually, those are autoimmune disorders that are causing gut inflammation. HGH allows for there to be a reversal of that.
Wow. I did not know that. It does, obviously, the dosaging amounts. I looked at some of the dosaging amounts for GH for wasting, and it was pretty high. It was like 28, 29 IUs a day, which, if you look at like the bodybuilding, I have no idea what those guys take, but I know that there's like a range of efficacy. Curious to know if like the dosaging, and then, on the other side, you always hear people talk about like, oh, HGH doesn't make that big a difference, but now you're talking about it as in terms of wasting disease. So obviously it does work as a performance enhancer.
It can. The primary place that I see HGH being used by athletes is in recovery from soft tissue damage, so connective tissues in particular. Ligaments and tendons, the most prime that we would normally see. Usually tendons are the big ones. And from your background, this part of it quite a bit. If you go through a periodized weight training program, or even if just it's going to be aerobic, it's not even have to be weight training, but you should have an anatomical adaptation phase at the beginning and then throughout to allow for the connective tissue to catch up. So one of the biggest things that we see with steroid use is that it makes the muscles massive very quickly, and the tendons can't catch up. They get stressed. You have joint issues. So a lot of reason people would take HGH primarily is to prevent those injuries from taking place in the first place, because it allows for those connective tissues to actually gain some additional mass. They get to hypertrophy at a similar rate to muscle at that point. And then also, obviously, they have very big impacts on body, what do you call it? Body composition. So you have a reduction in fat mass, increase in lean mass. So if you're a bodybuilder, that's exactly what you want. You want to be able to avoid injury from all the additional mass that you're putting on your joints that normally would not be there. And then obviously you want to improve your body composition to have more lean mass and less fat mass.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Do you want to build thick, sidewalk-splitting slabs of muscle? Let me introduce you to Jack Street. Get access to the same tried and true training methods I followed during my 10 years in the NFL, all to walk into training camp at 308 pounds at sub 8% body fat. Punch your ticket to the gain train and join thousands of residents already following Jack Street. Head to powerathletehq.com/Jack Street and claim your 7-day free trial today. Now back to the show. Is there a long-term studies on the efficacy and, more importantly, the dangers of HGH and let's say in athletes?
Not in athletes, no, because it's not legal for any.
Then general population, I would imagine.
So you're only going to see it typically in the disease populations that we spoke of, and in those instances, they're already deficient in that. So you're really just bringing them back up to where they would normally be as a normal individual. So in that case, they're relatively healthy throughout the remainder of their lives, because it's whatever they got is better than what they would have if they didn't have the HGH. Since it's not legal to prescribe that drug to normal individuals or athletes, at least within the United States, you're just not going to get a lot of studies here domestically. In Europe, there are a few. I cited a couple in my book specific to basically tendon repair. And so in those studies, now they weren't long-term studies, though. They were short-term, specifically looking at that one thing. So that to answer your question that you just asked, not really. There's a handful of them, and their sample sizes are remarkably small because it's just a very difficult study to actually get approved and then get people to be interested in taking HGH. Mm.
So
therein lies a large part of the problem, is that there's a lot of this that we just don't know because we can't get studies approved to actually do any real research to see if there are long-term negative effects of these drugs on individuals throughout their lives. And that's one of the primary reasons that WADA has their 3 rules or their 3 criteria for what is considered a doping agent. Is the safety and health of the athlete. Well, if we can't determine if there's any ramifications in terms of the safety and health of the athlete long term, then we can't really state for sure that that particular criteria is relevant to any one of these drugs.
Do you think it's about health? Do you think WADA and these other organizations are like
it's about control? It's about control. If it were about health, then we wouldn't allow athletes to play the majority of the games that we play in the first place. I mean, we can cite football. Yeah. My primary sport that I'm really interested in watching from a distance has always been cycling. And, you got guys flying down the Alps 60, 80 miles an hour in rain until the early 90s, no helmet. And so the every day of their occupation is much more dangerous than any of the drugs that they would even conceivably take. So it's always been a strange argument to me to hear people talk about the safety of the athlete when year after year we add more games. Yeah. We do more things to exploit the athlete. And that's not really what it comes down to.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show.
Well, I mean, think about in the NFL. I mean, part of the reason that the NFL pivoted so hard was all of a sudden you get Junior Seau and other, very famous world-class athletes, shooting themselves in the heart, leaving a note saying, look at my brain, something's wrong. And then all of a sudden the NFL had, serious, issues with public perception and this is game killing people. And, the problem is if parents think that, football's going to effectively affect their children like that, they're not going to start putting them in, and the NFL's going to lose their pool. So that's where the thing's
true.
Really hard.
There is that population that is going to be concerned about their kids' safety, but then there's going to be another huge group that's going to be even bigger than that. That's going to be saying, "Well, I played, I'm fine. Yeah. I'm going to let my kid play." Yeah. So, the sport's never going to go away. And there's, these sports are dangerous. That's just the way they are.
Yeah.
And I've got a very big libertarian bent in me. As long as you and the people who you played with and those that are coming up after you are well educated on what it is that you're putting yourselves through and the potential downstream effects of taking all these subconcussive hits over and over and over again, and you still choose to play for my gratification, what else is there to talk about?
I've said the exact same thing. And I've heard ex-players and guys I've, obviously played with and friends that have said, "Oh, if only I knew. If they would have told me, I wouldn't have played." And I'm like, you're so full of shit. If, knowing exactly what I know today, I still would have played the game. And I would have done it the exact same. I think there's ways to mitigate damage. I think things like hyperbaric chambers and, maybe some of the drugs that you're discussing definitely have a protective effect that I thought that players should be open to, that if they're injured or, if something catastrophic happens, you ask a guy to have a few surgeries in a few months, and then you're denying him anything to take to increase his healing. I think that's disingenuous.
I completely agree. And that's something I go over several times in the book, is just that. The NFL has a responsibility to its athletes to make sure that they're educated. And I think that they have a safety net once they're done. That there should be obviously a pension in place for athletes who have gone through all that they go through. Now, American sports, in terms of our 4 big leagues, are very different in terms of how they're administered than our international sports, than all the Olympic sports. We have labor representation within our 4 big leagues, which makes it so that they can negotiate which drugs will or will not be on a banned list, what they will or will not be tested for, and then what the punishments are going to be if they get caught. But they're significantly less deleterious to someone's career long-term than what happens on the international scene. Now, obviously, internationally, there are no labor unions for track athletes, for swimmers. It's all run and maintained by the International Olympic Committee. And so it's a very huge power disparity between the two. And so basically whatever they say goes. And that's the biggest part of the problem that I see as far as this is concerned, is that international athletes need to have some level of representation and control over what it is that they do for a living, like our own domestic athletes do.
What about athletes around the world in other countries? The U.S. almost has a attitude, with a lot of these Olympic sports and international sports of trying to like catch everybody. Whereas I feel like for a lot of the countries, they're looking at the best interest and they're vested in these athletes and them getting, popped for, illegal drugs or performance enhancers, like doesn't help their cause. So they tend to be protective in a lot of ways. I mean, it just feels like there's a lot of I gotcha attitude here in the U.S. where they're trying to catch people where it just feels like a different attitude around the world.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on which country it is that we're talking about. Obviously, you have two big examples with Russia and China, where it's not even a matter of they're trying to protect their athletes. They're actively doping their athletes. Yeah, I mean, they're doing it for them. And then if they get caught, then they just, they make an excuse for China just said it was an accident. We tainted all our athletes with this one drug, which I don't believe that at all. In other countries, it really depends. So, I mean, if you look at the Tour de France, this is something I go over quite a bit in my book. Lance Armstrong won the Tour seven consecutive times. So that's more than any other athlete has ever won the Tour. The record prior to him was 5, and it remains at 5. The tour organizers decided to just wipe out those 7 years. There is no winner of the Tour de France for that period of time.
How come?
They'll say that there is no one else to go back to. The second and third and fourth and fifth place people all have been either implicated or tested positive or busted for doping at some point or have admitted to it. So they would have had to drop down to number 20. And even then they wouldn't be confident that that person wasn't doping at that same time. So they just obliterated it. They could do the exact same thing for any period prior to Lance coming through, but they didn't. They picked on that one person, and he was, the devil incarnate as far as the Tour de France was concerned. And it's even more interesting. If you go, 2 years ago, I took my family to France for a trip, ostensibly partly to research for the book. But one of the places we went was Alpe d'Huez, which is one of the biggest mountain stages in the Tour, biggest mountain stages in cycling. And they have a little A-frame there with a list of all the different winners of that stage. And on the 2 years that Lance won it, they put up the second place finisher, who we all know was also doping because he's admitted to it. Yeah. So there's an attitude there in terms of protecting Europeans specifically. And then, all the outsiders, we can just toss them under the bus. So, do Europeans look at it the exact same way we do? Probably not, but they're not nearly as puritanical about many things in their culture as we are in ours. And this would just be one of those things. And even if you look at other sports, so another great example is, 2 years ago, Rafael Nadal won the French Open for the 14th time. Yeah. And he has a degenerative condition in his right foot, I believe. That basically one of the bones in there in his arch is just slowly breaking down over time because it doesn't have enough vascularization to feed the bone tissue that needs to stay alive. So he's had surgery to shore up the foot, but from time to time he'll get a flare. And during the French Open, he did. So he consulted with his doctors, and at the bare minimum that we know for sure that they did is that they gave him either Novocaine or lidocaine injections into his foot to numb it up. So that for 2 weeks, he just was playing tennis on a foot that he couldn't feel anything. Now, if he did that same thing in any other sport, they would probably, not allow you to compete. But because it's tennis specifically.
I'll tell you, I had a mild Liz Frank when I was playing, and they put a mix of lidocaine and Novocaine in the top of my foot and numb my foot before every game. I did that for an entire season.
So, that my whole argument is, if that's what he wanted to do, if that's what you wanted to do, and you knew what the potential ramifications of that decision would be, more power to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your own body. There's no chance. And I wouldn't tell Nadal what to do with this. He won the French Open that year. But if you took that same behavior and you transported it over to another sport, let's say cycling, you'd be out. Now, I suspect that he also probably had cortisone injections too, although no one ever said yes or no to that. If that were cycling, if he got a single cortisone injection, he'd be out for 8 days straight, couldn't compete, couldn't train until he could come back in.
Wow. So
the fact that we treat different athletes in different ways, that also makes a big mess out of everything.
Well, what's even more wild in the NFL for them to do that, they don't even have to tell anybody. They were on the sideline shooting my foot up. So
I'm not the least bit surprised.
Yeah, I mean, in the NFL, like they don't even have to fill out. I mean, it's not like I watch guys get cortisone shots, Toradol shots. I mean, the amount of stuff that they dumped into, guys fairly regularly in the NFL. I mean, so the fact that now you're like, oh, cortisone shot 8 days, like they wouldn't even have to put in a waiver and exemption or anything in the NFL. It's like it's like cowboy stuff.
Yeah. I've got a number of cortisone injections. I don't know any athlete who hasn't gotten a number of cortisone injections at some point in their life.
Me, 0.
0. You've never gotten a cortisone shot?
No, I've never got a cortisone shot.
Toradol?
Oh yeah, Toradol shots. So my rule on Toradol was only when it got cold. So I always I always caution guys about going to the what we call vitamin T or to Toradol too early. I knew guys that were getting Toradol shots in preseason. And I told him, I'm like, dude, once you start getting the Toradol shot, you got to keep getting it. And if you have to wait as long as you can. So my rule was no Toradol until it got cold, which was usually in like the, fourth part of the season or the, last quarter of the season, usually like game 12. And
is that because of the timing of when it was in the season, or is there something specific to cold?
No, I think the cold too was for the hands. I remember when I was playing in Philly, I had bruised my hands so bad during a game I couldn't make fists, and they gave me a Toradol shot, and I remember like 10 minutes later being able to make fists and being like, oh man, like all of a sudden it reduced all the inflammation. I went out there and played incredible, and I just remember, looking it up and talking to people about Toradol, and is there going to be long-term effects, and then if you look at it from surgery, they only do it for like 3 days. They don't do prolonged stuff. One of my former teammates, a guy named Jeremy Newberry, I think he's had some serious liver. He might have had a liver transplant at this point, but I mean, he was
liver and kidneys are the two big ones with Toradol in particular.
Yeah, I'd have to look up exactly what his, but they were giving him Toradol shots in preseason. Now I'm sure he went in there asking for it. Hey, I want to play. I want to earn my job and, do this. And they probably didn't explain to him because they don't know the long-term effects of daily Toradol shot. I also thought when you start mixing it with, maybe some pre-workout, a bunch of anti-inflammatories, and you start making these cocktails, and then you're asking the guy to go out and play. I think that's, and then he probably goes out and has a dozen drinks after the game. All these things are probably contributing factors. So
sure.
My big one was only at the end of the season. Only when it got cold, just because if I was going to expose myself to it, maybe the last 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season when you really need it. But, there's some other things you could do. I mean, I was big on contrast and, recovery, but I always caution guys against going too quickly to it, because also if you did get hurt and you needed it and you'd been taking it all this time, then when you get hurt and you legitimately need this, it has a much more diminished effect.
Yep.
So.
Agreed.
Yeah.
What's next?
I am. I know you get into some history on performance enhancing. I thought that was pretty fascinating, getting into the Greek and the Romans. What was it? Mead, beer, and wine, and then some of the early research that I'm sure you've done on performance enhancing and what that looked like for those original athletes of antiquity.
Yeah, that part I didn't go into as much because they really kind of stuck with those, those low octane kind of dopings. But it was the same basic premise. I mean, they're trying to steel themselves. They want to get psyched up, not be so anxious. So, I mean, any kind of alcohol is going to be very effective. But then they would do a lot of stuff that I probably didn't have much impact. A lot of cow and horse urine and stuff like that. But they would also, interestingly enough, I read a couple of papers where there is. I'm not sure how they got this in terms of the data, but they would take either sheep or cow testicles and then stitch them immediately underneath their skin in their abdomen. And they would see that they would be able to put on some additional muscle mass for about the 3 weeks while that testicle was still viable. And then they would take it out, which is pretty gross.
That is really gross. What would be, I mean, like, I'm kind of at a loss on that one. What would be the performance enhancing effect of sewing a testicle underneath your skin?
It's going to give you a boost of testosterone. I mean, that's the biggest thing you're going to get. It'll, an interesting level. What they say happened, and I guess this has been tried since then, is that the place that they're putting it in your abdomen, which is directly obviously underneath the skin, it's highly vascularized, and so there's some level before it gets rejected, and that's the dangerous part, is that you get some ingrowth of capillaries into this area to keep it alive, and it will continue to produce testosterone and dump it out into the bloodstream. So, a boost of testosterone, I guess, is a good thing. This also carried on to the early ages of baseball. There were lots of athletes who would eat cow, horse, sheep testicles for the same reason. Whether or not they got a lot of testosterone from that or not, it's hard to even say. But you can see early on that the thought is, this is just another thing I'm going to do as a professional to improve my performance, because I have a responsibility to myself and my country and my team to do these things. And so I don't view that as being any different than taking the latest supplement that's come on the market that has an unknown active ingredient list, but you're still going to take it anyway and risk whatever may be in there. It's the same basic attitude. There are much more dangerous supplements that people were taking, or substances that people were taking early on in the 1900s. The most dangerous that I've seen is strychnine. I mean, we think of that as mostly being a poison, but it acts as a stimulant. So in terms of stimulating the central nervous system, it'll do that, perk you up a bit. But then it also has direct impacts on skeletal muscle and their ability to contract over long durations of time. But it's a remarkably dangerous drug to take.
Yeah, no, I would agree on that. So obviously we saw performance enhancing in antiquity. What would you say really like the atomic bomb, the drop of performance enhancing and really coming in? I mean, would that be Russia, Nazi Germany, where now all of a sudden they were, using methamphetamine and testosterone, synthesizing these different versions of testosterone and putting like a drug protocol in place?
So East Germany would be the one that I would consider the most. Their capabilities in terms of what they were able to do. They did it in all sports, but the one that we document the most is obviously swimming. And they did it both male and female athletes, but it's obviously going to have a bigger impact on female athletes because they don't have the same levels of testosterone. So they generated their own undetectable form of steroid at the time called oral turinabol. And they systematically doped their athletes, most of them unknowing, for years and years and years. And they had tremendous benefits from that in terms of what they could accomplish on the international scene. I mean, it's a really small country. Winning all but 3 events in one Olympics is a pretty big deal for swimming on the women's side. Once the Berlin Wall fell down and we got a chance to actually see the records and see exactly what it was that they were doing, it was pretty diabolical. There's some really good. Faust's Gold is a really good book that documents that all the way through, start to finish. So there's that. And then we were suspicious of the Germans, the East Germans in 72 and 76, but we didn't have any direct evidence to support our contentions. Once the Berlin Wall came down in the early 90s, then we got to see it. There were several trials in Germany during reunification to punish some of the doctors who were doing these things. After that, the next big cataclysmic event that made everybody say, doping, was when Ben Johnson popped at the 88 Olympics in Seoul. He ran like a 9.79, I think, which was, just an unheard of time back then. And then there was the Canadian Olympic Committee had a trial effectively, and they got a lot of great information from them. But, in that case there, what everybody was hoping for was that they were going to give them some level of immunity, and they just banished everybody. So then anybody interested in talking after that point said, no chance, because I'm not going to get banished for the rest of my life. After that, there were a couple other big incidences that happened in 66. A cyclist from Britain, Simpson, he died on the Ventoux, which is another one of the big alpine mountain peaks in the Tour de France. It was hot that day. He had definitely taken some amphetamines, and he had also mixed that with brandy. And the combination of the three just dehydrated him to the point where he collapsed and died. That was a huge thing. Shortly thereafter, they started testing for some drugs in cycling. The last big one that we all know is when EPO hit the scene. So erythropoietin has the capacity to improve athletic performance by about 10%. 10% doesn't sound like much, but if you look at the entire field of the tour, from first place to dead last place is about 10%. So it's a major improvement in your capacity to perform endurance activities over long durations of time. And I mean, everybody remembers, at least hearing about Lance Armstrong and maybe seeing his episodes, his 2 episodes on Oprah when he admitted to it. So in terms of the landmarks of events that took place to make us feel that, this was an epidemic issue that needed to be handled in a very harsh manner, those are some big ones that were along the way. Since that time, things have started to shift the other way. And the one that I'll put out there that really impacted me and really stimulated me to finally write this book after thinking about it for years was when Sha'Carri Richardson in Oregon during the 2020 Olympic trials that were held in 2021 on account of COVID. She won that heat by a huge distance, and then 2 days later she popped for THC and she was disqualified. So that to me was just criminal. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that is performance enhancing about THC. The argument goes that the performance enhancing element of it is that it allows you to zone in and focus entirely because you're stoned. I've been stoned a number of times, and there's no possible way I could perform any of the athletic events that I've ever done in my life at a high level under those conditions. So when she was bumped, particularly considering it happened in Oregon, where marijuana is legal, and she bought her edible legally, it's just awful to see that actually happen to that person. So, that, and it wasn't just my outrage, it was across the board, particularly when we see how the International Olympic Committee handles Russian athletes who are systematically doped by their country. They get stripped of their Russian flag and they have to compete under the Olympic flag, but that's not really a punishment. And it doesn't do anything to rectify the situation in terms of they have a huge competitive advantage relative to the other athletes that they're competing against whose countries are not systematically doping. So when you have that contrast between the two, you say, is this really how we want to adjudicate these rules and laws? Do we want water really coming down on someone for smoking a joint because 2 days prior to her big event, she found out that her biological mother had died? It's just, it's awful the way that we treated her.
Yeah, I agree. I never thought marijuana was a performance enhancer.
No.
I'm not a marijuana type of person, but I do feel much more comfortable with them, like in the NFL, instead of handing out painkillers like breath mints.
Sure.
Offering that as a viable solution or on a different I guess you could say option, right? Like if you want to take this or this, the research is pretty conclusive after the age of about 26. There's no physiological or mental kind of changes with THC and marijuana. Obviously it's much more dangerous in kids.
Sure.
So,
but that's true for any drug. Yeah. So, let's be specific there. In a developing brain, in a pre-adolescent and adolescent, we don't want them drinking. We don't want them doing drugs. We don't want them doing a number of things. And so when people bring up that argument to me, I was like, well, we're not talking about kids. We're talking about full-grown adults. Yep. And not just in the terms of pain management, but also in terms of using them as anxiolytics. The other option that you could get would be a prescription. They're usually going to give you Xanax. Xanax is nasty. It is habit forming. Yeah. And it's difficult to get off if you get on. So, again, if we have a choice between the two, I'd rather get something that grows out of the ground on every continent of this planet.
Yeah, but the problem is the drug companies don't own that stuff that grows out of the. So now we're looking at it like, but
they could, if we made it legal, they would find a way to make that another thing that they would go after. So you're right. You're absolutely right. I don't know that it's the pressure for keeping these things illegal is coming from the drug companies, because they would just find a way to monetize it as quickly as they possibly could. There's a social stigma. There's a racial stigma historically that goes into marijuana for sure, and other illicit drugs. And so, we could go on and on about that for ages. But, back to your big question. Since then, I've seen a big turnaround in the way that people feel about the notion of doping to begin with. So much so that now we're going to have in 2025, the enhanced games.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter Thiel put that out. Which one are you going to watch? But here's a thing that I made a joke about it. What's going to happen is they're going to have an enhanced games, and then they're going to come out and do all the same events, and they're going to be no better than what we saw in our own Olympics. They're going to be on
probably, but who are they recruiting in? I mean, they're going to get the best athletes that they can get to sign up for this, but they're not going to necessarily get the cream of the crop. And so it's not going to be, but so to your point, let's say that we don't necessarily have the cream of the crop in the enhanced games relative to what we would have in the Olympics, but the performances are almost equal. Well, that tells me that we've enhanced those not necessarily alpha athletes up to alpha status. So, and I don't even know that really the performance is the key issue. I mean, you already seen what they've done. They're going to give 50,000 or something like that for a gold medal for each one of the athletes who actually wins it. The Olympics doesn't give anything in terms of monetary compensation.
That's true.
So it's a complete exploitation of the athletes, complete. And to some degree, the nation that actually hosts it. In this case, they're already going to be affecting change, because once you actually have athletes being paid, the other side has to make changes. Otherwise, they're going to be, they're going to go the way of the dodo in some form.
Well, and my other favorite is say, let's say you do win a gold medal, then the U.S. actually hits you with taxes for the value of it.
Yes.
So not only do you make nothing, but if you do win,
you get penalized.
You get penalized by having to pay taxes on this medal. The one drug that I had never heard of that kind of popped up when Sharapova got popped was I think it was called meldonium. Yeah, meldonium.
Yeah.
And, she took it, I think she had some, what was it? It was like low iron and some other things, and this drug fixed it. But I mean, that drug had been around for 50 years. And
it's a vasodilator specifically to heart tissue. So if you have angina or something of that ilk, then this allows you to get more blood flow to your heart. So she said that she had a heart condition, although she didn't actually specify which one it was, that required her to take meldonium for her entire life up to that point. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm suspicious of it, but that drug was made illegal, for January 1 of that year. I guess she didn't get the memo, and it was not even a month later that she popped the first time. I think it was actually at the Australian Open, so it may have been in January. So it was just a couple of weeks after it became illegal. So even there, I mean, the WADA is not really doing a tremendously good job of communicating with their athletes to tell them what is and is not illegal, and to just say, look, we've now put this drug on, and they know who does and doesn't take the drug in terms of what countries. So tell them you can't have this in your system or you're going to get popped.
Yeah, well, she had been drug tested before, so they obviously knew it was in her system, and then they come out and ban it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why can't you send her a memo beforehand saying, look, we've now put this on there, so please make sure that you don't have it in your system next time you come for a competition. They could have easily done that.
Yeah, but I feel a lot of times with like the drug testing stuff, there's this like I gotcha moment where they want they want to catch people, and maybe it's a justification for their own money, or maybe it looks like they're trying to do their jobs. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really cares. I mean, the only people I ever hear care about this stuff is if people that are like, well, if only I had access to this, I could have played in the NFL. And I'll tell you this 100 times over. I never saw any performance enhancers make a shitty player a good player. All they did is they made a shitty player a bigger shitty player, and they made a good player a bigger good player, or a healthier good player. Mm-hmm. So I even said to one guy one time, I'm like, I would buy you every performance enhancing drug you want. You can take them all, and I guarantee you won't even get a look to play in an NFL team. It just
That's right.
But there's this idea, and I wonder if it's like an ego, or just maybe it's people telling themselves what they want to hear, where like, oh, I could have done that job if only I had access to this.
Sure. And you hear people saying this all the time, the performance we saw in the field wasn't the athlete, it was the drugs. Well, that's just nonsense. That was an enhanced athlete. It's still the athlete. So in cycling parlance, this is called turning a donkey into a racehorse. You can't just sit on the couch, not train, and take EPO, and then all of a sudden you're going to be the best athlete out there. Now, we did see lots and lots of sprinters who are significantly bigger than these diminutive little climbers who were keeping pace or even beating them when they were on EPO and the climber wasn't. But, catch up. I mean, that's just all there is to it. The same thing is going to be true for athletic equipment. I mean, there's the idea of mechanical doping. The best examples of this right now are, the Nike shoes, the Vaporflies. So they have this elastic recoil that actually brings energy back into the foot after it hits the ground, which allows you to spring off and, it absorb less of the impact as you hit. There was a big controversy whether or not athletes should be able to wear those shoes because other athletes didn't have access to them. You pick the wrong shoe company. That's competition too. as far as I'm concerned. Now, if they want to level the playing field there, that's fine. But I'm not going to, the alternative with that is that we just go back to running in sandals and loincloths. That's never the way things are going to advance. They always go one direction, to greater technology, better improvements in performance.
Well,
I get your point entirely.
In swimming with the shark skins, where they were wearing those suits,
right.
And then all of a sudden they smashed everything. And it was very efficient and made these guys, swim more efficiently. But at the end of the day, they still had to do the swimming. So
exactly. And so that's one of the misconceptions that I put in my book is that, when I hear people talk to me about why they object to people taking performance enhancing drugs, and I want to see the real product on the field. Okay. That performance enhancing drug that the athlete is taking, they said that it's a shortcut, right? That's the term you always hear. The athletes who take performance enhancing drugs are taking a shortcut to getting to their end game quicker and easier than they would otherwise. And it's the exact opposite that's actually true. If you looked at the data from the East German swimmers, the primary thing that the testosterone that they were taking allowed them to do was train longer and train harder, which made it so they could swim faster when it came time for competition. If any athlete would have tried to maintain those same training logs without the use of testosterone to recover between, they would have overtrained themselves and died out earlier on. So it's the exact opposite of what you would think in terms of a shortcut. The performance enhancing drugs actually allow for the athlete to do more and harder work than they would be able to otherwise.
Yeah, and then also be able to recover, like you said, in between training sessions. So it's a higher volume. Mm-hmm. What do you think this gets back to at its core? Is it people like, for me, I want to see the greatest performance of the best athletes on the biggest stage. And I think for a lot of people, there's a feeling of some jealousy or some envy that like, hey, these are the reasons that I wasn't able to do this. And,
maybe,
I go back and forth and like, is it really about the athletes? Is it really about safety? Or is it really about, people's egos? Think about like like we were talking earlier about baseball. Probably the best time in baseball was when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were in their home run hit.
I completely agree with you.
Again,
there's a whole chapter on 98 in my book.
Yeah. Whether the ball was juiced, the bats were juiced, or they were juiced, who cared? Baseball came off the strike and it was dead. And those guys come out and that home run hitting, we couldn't wait to come home and watch baseball just to see them hit the long ball.
So, brief history on this for the listeners who don't know. In 94, there was a strike that canceled the World Series for only the second time in the history of Major League Baseball. And all the fans were stupendously pissed off, as they should have been. Attendance the following year, when they finally came back, was so much lower than it had been before. And it really did not come back to normal levels until starting in 98 with that race, and then a couple of years thereafter. And everybody and their dog knew that at least Sammy Sosa, if not also Mark McGwire, was juiced. And all you had to do was look at pictures of them from the early 90s until 98. Yeah. And if you want to go even further, then you look 3 years later with Barry Bonds. You look at his pictures when he was with the Pirates compared to what he looked like when he was with the Giants. He was massive, just massive.
He was like 260.
Now, everybody and their dog loved the events of that summer. And then all of a sudden, Congress decides that they want to have these hearings, and then baseball throws all the players under the bus. And there's nobody in baseball who did not know that this was taking place, and they rode that train as long as they possibly could because it was bringing back baseball to mainstream life. It was making it relevant again. And so for me, I just find it utterly disgusting. They didn't get rid of any of the records. Barry Bonds' record still stands. We know for sure that he took it because his grand jury testimony was leaked. So he was on two different drugs while he was doing not just the single season record, but then in 2007, all the way up to there, the lifelong record for home runs.
What were the drugs he was taking?
So his big one was the clear. So they had the cream and the clear.
Yeah.
Right. So the clear was a designer.
Yeah, it was the Victor Conti, Pat Arnold deal.
Balco, right? Victor Conti with Balco. So they would get a clear steroid concoction that they would put underneath their tongue, and then the cream was epitestosterone. So the primary test that they're going to give you for testosterone is to look at the ratio between epi and real testosterone, as it were. Or if they get too far out of whack, or if you're taking exogenous testosterone, then obviously the ratio changes dramatically. We have way more testosterone than epi. So they give you this cream to wipe on your skin. It gets absorbed, and that's almost entirely epi testosterone, and that brings you back up here. So with the test, you're not really looking at the specific numbers. You're just looking at the ratio. And since it was a synthetic designer testosterone, the clear, they wouldn't have been able to catch it anyway because they didn't know what they were looking for. So, he and everybody else who was busted with Balco were taking those same ones. But in terms of going back to the idea of baseball, I mean, they knew what was happening. They wrote it. And then it wasn't until they were threatened with losing their antitrust, rulings that they were then obliged to make changes. And part of that was to dump everybody under the bus.
Mm. Well, I also think it's funny that Congress decides that doping, and more importantly, performance enhancing in professional baseball, is what's ruining America. Which I think it's
because they have nothing better to do with their time than this nonsense.
It's a smokescreen. Instead of I've always felt that whenever something polarizing happens within the media or these other events, it's more of like, hey, look over here, because they don't want us to see what's going on over there. So, sure. I mean, it's a lot easier for them.
And the primary thing that they were ostensibly having these hearings for were for the protection of children, because these are all role models, and we can't have them behaving in this way because then the kids will do it as well. Again, in my book, I put in there, prior to those hearings, you can look at the number of athletes or number of teenagers who died specifically from taking performance-enhancing drugs, and specifically testosterone. That number is the exact same as the subsequent 15 years thereafter, when they started testing and everything. Nothing changed. Whether you want to call people or not, nothing changed. And now just one more point on this. Do you remember the Nike commercial with it was Tom Glavine and Maddox? Right. And so the two Atlantic Braves pitchers, and they're doing pitching practice. And they're playing McGuire that night, and all the ladies are in love with McGuire. So they decide that they're going to go get jacked and start hitting long balls too. Yeah. Right. So they're making this enormous joke out of, chicks dig the long ball. The message is very clear. Get bigger and you can hit home runs, and then people will be more interested in pitchers like they are in second baseman or first baseman. But this is something that was signed off on by Nike. It was signed off on by the athletes. It was signed off on by Major League Baseball. And all of us consumers said the same thing. If you get bigger, you can hit the ball longer. Chicks dig the long ball. Sure. So we're marketing it at every single level, right? And all the fans are absorbing this. But then you have this small minority of fans who claim that they didn't know. I guess they're just oblivious to, just baseball in general and its history. And they get tremendously offended by the fact that these athletes have taken these drugs. The interesting thing is, if you look at other occupations outside of sports, so the one I go after in my book is specifically symphony players. A survey of, I can't remember the number, but hundreds of symphony players came back with around 77% admitted to taking beta blockers without a prescription, strictly for the purposes of slowing down their hands from shaking and keeping their heart from beating as hard. That's a performance-enhancing drug. They have no business taking a beta blocker. You don't take that unless you have massively high blood pressure or just chronically high blood pressure. So they're taking a drug that they have no business taking that does have long-term ramifications if you take it, if you don't need it, so they can perform better in their job. No one gives a shit, because no one is emotionally invested in symphony players as they are in football players, baseball players, basketball players, or any other athlete. So we make this difference. We make a differential judgment in terms of which occupation these people are in. I know more people than I can count who take Adderall without a prescription so that they can concentrate better for studying, for work, even before they go to a party, so they have a little bit more confidence to talk to a female or a male. So, performance enhancing drugs are everywhere. And it just depends on how it exactly is that we define them in our culture. So why it is that we blacklist somebody for taking a performance enhancing drug in their specific occupation being athletics, but not in symphonics, I have no idea. But it's something that we do all the time.
Is there a certain sport that is extremely dirty that people wouldn't necessarily think is? Like, is like I always thought, and I'll just tell you where the question comes from. I've always been a tennis fan, and I love watching the tour. I mean, I love watching, you know, the Australian Open and Wimbledon and you know, the French Open. I've always thought if there was ever a sport where performance-enhancing drugs were used, it had to be professional tennis, where they're out there for 3 hours in the sun playing with the same level of intensity on the first hit that they do on the last. And to me, that always, like, whenever people ask me about it, I was like, I would look at it and say women's and men's tennis has to be one of the biggest.
Anecdotally, I've heard quite a bit about tennis as one place. And I mean, tennis itself is obviously looser with its rules in terms of what people can and can't do with injections right before, during, or after a match. You know, the biggest one, but people have already heard about it, is cycling in terms of its history of doping. Another one that I know quite well, again, because I have plenty of friends who play both domestically and internationally, is rugby. There's a lot of folks in rugby who will take performance-enhancing drugs, predominantly, again, for the purposes of recovery, because they just get pounded to dust during a game. You know, I mean, they hit just as hard as American football players do, but they don't have protective equipment of any kind. And so they get lots of crush injuries on muscles in particular, which testosterone obviously will help in terms of, you know, building back up muscle tissue that's damaged, joint issues. HGH is big there. And then tons of painkillers. Now, is it dirtier than other sports? I think it's tough to say. It also depends on where it is that this is taking place internationally. Cricket's a big sport. The games go on forever, but they're not really high impact necessarily, but they're just extremely long. So they have a lot of athletes who will take amphetamines to stay perked up and alive and ready to play.
Yeah. No, I've you know, I remember turning on ESPN2 and them showing cricket games in India, and there's like 300,000 people watching. Oh, and the games go on just for like
cacophony.
Yeah,
so loud. The other places that I would say that are really dirty, that people probably don't understand it or actually get to see on a regular basis, are any sport where you have to cut weight. And if you have to cut weight quickly, that process, no matter how it is that you want to do it, is gross. It is extremely detrimental to the body on the long term. There have been a number of athletes who have died from the process. There's a number of others who have been who just had to stop the sport altogether because they just couldn't take it anymore after they had to do that. So those are the kinds of things that if people actually saw that, they'd be really, really grossed out.
Yeah. Now, you know, Alex Pereira is one of the classics example. I mean, you know, he's killing it in the UFC, but I mean, you know, shows up at 185 pounds and then steps in the next day at 220 and is, you know, is able to cut. I was always under the impression, and this is just, you know, working with different coaches that have done weight cuts for athletes. Their contention is there's only so many weight cuts an athlete has. So there's only so many times you can go to the well, and then they get to the point where they just physically cannot do it and survive it. So I mean, just the detriment to the body is so hard.
You know, and if you think about what you're actually trying to do to the body, I mean, you want to lose upwards of 10 or 15 pounds in some instances. That's really going to come off as water, especially in the short term. I mean, you're just not going to get a whole lot of additional mass off in a 24 to 48 hour period other than it being water. And so that hyperconcentrates the blood, which makes it very difficult for the kidneys and the liver to do their jobs. And beyond that, and if you have a longer weight cut, then you're talking about losing muscle mass for sure, because fat just doesn't come off that quickly. And then the methods that they use to get that the weight off is almost always going to be sweating. So the higher the body temperature, the more likely that you're going to be burning muscle as opposed to fat, because fat just gets inhibited in terms of its oxidation in warm bodies.
So in the performance enhancing, let's say in the science of performance enhancing, I feel like there's always kind of this like almost like this gap where, you know, hey, like, you know, USADA and these different organizations are testing for this kind of pool of drugs. And then there's kind of a gap. And then there's people that are kind of outliers that are on the front side of this thing that are performance enhancing with things that aren't known yet. And I feel like that's kind of this like cat and mouse where, hey, we're performance enhancing. And that's why I always like to, when they're like, you know, you go do a drug test, you know, this and any future, we save these samples for 3 years and continue to test them for the mere fact that like they know that there are things out there that athletes are using that haven't become, you know, public knowledge yet, that haven't made it onto their list.
Mm-hmm. So there is, and obviously, I mean, some of the better examples of that would be Balco. I mean, Victor Conti had a friend of his who was a chemist, And he went through the East German catalog of different drugs that were produced by the East German pharmaceutical company that they had, the state run. And he found one that he could tweak just a little bit chemically, but all that did was make it so that the testers couldn't find it, but it had basically the exact same impact on the body. They never would have been caught had a disgruntled either coach or athlete who Conti pissed off hadn't sent in a syringe with some of the clear still in it to USADA and anonymously did so, but we're pretty sure we know who it is at this point. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that typically happen. Somebody gets jealous and they will send in a sample, and then it gets caught from that point forward. And then all the chemists are going to do is we'll just make a different one. Yeah. Just keep on going down this path. So there's an inevitability to this as well. It's obvious that the athletes want to do this. Not all of them. Obviously, there's some that they're not interested in ever taking performance-enhancing drugs. They just don't want to. And I respect that. But the vast majority, they're going to do it. Yeah. And so, a really important point, and some people make this argument all the time, is like, my favorite athlete's never tested positive. All that means that he hasn't been caught. All it means that they have not developed a test for whatever it is he may or may not be testing or taking right now. It also may mean that he's not actually taking anything, but all we can conclusively state is that the test that he took, he passed it because either that test didn't work for what it is he's currently on, or they didn't test him for what it is he's currently on. So you have to be very careful with the judgments that you make in terms of which athletes are clean and which athletes are dirty.
Yeah, I mean, unless you know them. I work with some professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu players, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is extremely dirty with drugs, to the point where it's is it destroying the sport? It probably could. The guys I work with have made a pretty conscious decision to not take drugs, but then again, they just started lifting weights for the first time last year. So and when they asked me about it, I'm like, you guys are making gains that guys on drugs would be excited to make because you're in this novice window. And then my other joke to him is one day you'll be strong enough to where we could actually have this conversation. But until that day, don't even ask me about it. It's I really think for certain sports, there's like a knowledge gap where the athletes and the coaches that are kind of working with them don't really know what the best form of training is. So what they end up doing is, because they just don't know and the knowledge is low, they just take drugs because it's an easy stopgap to be able to make up for just a lack of training knowledge. And then, and as I try to explain to them, I'm like, in jiu-jitsu, you guys are behind in strength conditioning. So guys are taking drugs to make up for it. But when you look at other professional sports like, or Olympic sports like track and swimming and these guys have already maximized all of their genetic potential. And they're using the drugs as like the last few percent to try to, win a gold or catch this deal. So it's kind of like similar to when, kids, younger kids, let's say under the age of 21, want to take drugs. And I've had people through this podcast and this ask me questions. And I'm like, you're at such a young age. Why would you stymie your own genetic potential? You're going to get to a point where the gains and more importantly, your performance is going to start to slow down. But if you take that too soon, then how do you ever know how far your genetic potential will really take you?
That's right. And so, I mean, and the other thing to consider that, particularly with athletes who are growing at a rapid rate because they're adolescents, right? So then you have that speed of growth, particularly within their muscles and their bones. And then you're amplifying that on top of it with testosterone or some steroid, but you're not actually looking out for the connective tissue. And so the same thing that I said back in the front, if you take somebody who's actively growing and then amplify it, there's no way those tendons are going to keep up. And so you get these blown out tendons, you get separated biceps, pectoral muscles, quads. That kind of stuff happens on a regular basis. And that's the easiest way to tell which of your teenage athletes is doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing. Because you can certainly get a strain for a joint, but to get a separated bicep, pec, or quad in particular, there's something special going on in that muscle. It is significantly stronger than it's supposed to be.
If you were going to, let's say, how can I say this better where it doesn't sound so shady? Do you think that there's a certain kind of, like if you were going to, like the rules were gone, and you didn't have to necessarily worry about performance enhancing, are there certain drugs or there certain performance enhancing protocols that lend themselves to certain sports? Like you talked about rugby, testosterone, GH, and painkillers, whereas that protocol might not be best for swimming, whereas, cycling, obviously the testosterone, the GH, and maybe like EPO.
EPO is going to be huge.
for just about every
huge.
sport.
So, well, sorry?
It's for just about any sport, I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. The sprint sports EPO is not going to be very helpful because they're not really aerobic necessarily. But what they do is they allow you to recover quicker between your bouts. So if you have 12 events you're going to swim at the Olympics, they're all sprint events, EPO would be very helpful for that. But even within swimming, so EPO is the big, that's huge. If you can increase your hematocrit and your oxygen carrying capacity to your muscles, you're going to stave off, your anaerobic threshold quite a bit longer than you would otherwise. So that's just massive. So a 10% increase is something that hadn't been seen before. So therein lies where, Lance Armstrong called the stuff that they were doing before, which would have been testosterone, cortisol, amphetamines, those kinds of things. Those were low octane doping. They'll help you in the margins. But again, like you're saying, if you're not adequately trained, they're not going to do much to bring you up. But EPO, that was just a whole other place. So before they had a test for EPO, what they would do for cycling, UCI made it so that if you had a hematocrit above 50, that was your threshold. And this is what they deem not safe. And so for safety reasons, we're going to pull you out of the race. We're not accusing you of anything, but there's something going on with your body and your blood is too thick, so we need to pull you out. Prior to that rule, which I think was in 2000, athletes, actually it was earlier than that, it was in the late 90s, but athletes could just dope away. And so they would get their hematocrit up into the 60s. Now, if you don't know what the hematocrit level should be, we're talking 30 to 40, maybe a little bit higher than that for some athletes, but by and large, it's in that range. So to have a hematocrit, which is the percentage of your blood that's all red blood cells, above 60 is huge. And you'd see these athletes just dominating in ways that really were never seen before. And so if there's one drug for specifically endurance athletes, it's going to be EPO or something else that will actually increase your hematocrit to that level. There's other methods that you can use that don't require you to have EPO at all. To some degree, you can use hyperbaric training. You can use hyperbaric tents to sleep in. The old adage of, live low and train high, live high and train low is what you're really looking for there, but it still won't get you all the way up to the level that you would with EPO. You can take out your own blood and do an autologous blood transfusion. There's obviously dangers to that. If you don't store the blood correctly and you get a bag full of lice blood, you're going to be remarkably sick. If you were working with some sloppy people and they give you Doug's bag instead of your bag, you're going to get remarkably sick, or you could, unless they're unless they have the same blood type as you. And so those kinds of things happen on a regular basis. So again, we come back to the idea of safety. Of those things that you can do, which is going to be the most beneficial in terms of your athletic performance and which is going to be the safest? Clearly, taking an injection of EPO over time is going to be safer than taking an autologous blood transfusion. And it's going to be less difficult than trying to sleep in a hyperbaric chamber every single night or train in one.
Oh, shit. Do you think that the extent of Lance Armstrong, and I didn't really dig in on what he admitted to. I know he admitted to performance enhancing. I don't know if he got into the specifics. Was it just EPO, or was it a cascade of myriad of drugs?
Yeah, we took a ton of stuff. So he was taking insulin like growth factor 1, HGH, cortisol, and then testosterone. Those would be the 5 big ones that he would have been taking prior to EPO coming on the scene. Do I think that it made it so that he could be who he was? I absolutely do. And the reason for it is historically, he'd only finished the tour one time prior to 1999, and his best finish was 37. He'd been in the tour 5 times, I think, at that point, and the other 4 he had to drop out. So he was not known as a climber by any stretch. After his cancer diagnosis, his body composition changed pretty dramatically. If you see him before he had cancer versus after, he lost a ton of weight. And he maintained it off for the rest of the time, which is not unusual for people coming off of cancer. But the EPO made it so that he could climb in a different way. So one misnomer is when we say that since everybody was taking it, it was a level playing field. Not necessarily, because people respond to the different performance-enhancing drugs in a different way. You have some people who will take testosterone and still won't put on additional muscle mass no matter how much they lift. They can put on a little bit extra, but not much. I started taking testosterone after my wife and I had to go on hormone replacement therapy because I had testicular cancer in 98. And when my wife and I were trying to have our first kid, I didn't have any testosterone left. So they put me on HGH initially to stimulate my own testosterone production without bringing down my sperm count. Once that was done, because that was every other day, a CC injection, We did it for almost 2 years before we finally got pregnant, and it stayed because we had one miscarriage along the way. By the second trimester, my doctor was like, go on testosterone. You don't want to keep doing this anymore. And so I did. And the combination of just the pretty minimal weights that I was lifting at the time and the testosterone together, I went from being 190 for my entire life from 20 to 35 to now I'm 260 and I maintain there, and I don't lift a ton. So that is very different than some of my other friends who have been on testosterone. They may have put on an extra 5 or 6 pounds, but they leaned out a lot more. And so it's, each person responds to the doses that they're taking in terms of that performance enhancing drug in a different way. When it comes to EPO, let's say you have, 50 is your threshold. If your natural hematocrit's at 48, and then the nearest competitor is at 42, and you're both right there with each other, they're going to get a bump of 8 points on their hematocrit. You're only going to get a bump of 2. So that extra oxygen carrying capacity for your competitor is more than what you're going to get. It's not a level playing field. And so that's just it's a caution out there for people who believe what I believe, that we need to make some of these things legal. It's not necessarily a level playing field, but nothing is. When it comes to sport, nothing is.
So how do you figure out like what to make legal and not? I mean, I feel like it's kind of an all or nothing deal. Like, how do you go through and be like, well, we'll allow this one, but we won't allow this one? I mean, like it, I kind of understand their point of view, and that, like once you open the floodgates, it's kind of like this NIL deal, let the players control. And now all of a sudden you have guys that are transferring twice in 1 year. And it's just like, without some regulation, NIL, it's going to destroy college sports. So they're going to have to go back and put some, I guess you could say, modification and really just some like controls in it. But I just wonder, how do you kind of open this up, and what do you say to guys who say, all right, well, this one's okay, but this is not?
Yeah, and that is the critical, difficult, part of it. I'm really focused on the things that are going to help people come back from injury and help them maintain their performance at a continuous level throughout the course of a long season. And so I'm talking about things that are going to reduce inflammation, reduce muscle breakdown, or actually allow for some level of anabolism. And so what we're talking about there are, testosterone is the primary one there, that's going to help you with it, or some other anabolic, but not necessarily androgenic steroid. So the difference between anabolic allows you to just put on the muscle mass, whereas if you have an anabolic steroid that also has androgenic effects, then you get secondary sexual characteristics that we would normally see with puberty. So more hair all over the body, less hair on top of your head, acne. In females, you would get the development of an Adam's apple. Your clitoris may become enlarged. So those are the kinds of things that you would try to avoid. So if you're looking for specifically an anabolic versus an androgenic steroid. But really what it comes down to is, like you said, once you open that gate, it's open, and it's difficult to justify closing it. But when you have athletes who are clearly injured and they're just trying to bring themselves back to the playing field to play where they were, then they're not really enhancing their performance. All they're doing is bringing themselves back up to their baseline level that they would be at without that injury in place. I think just humanely, if you or I were working just a day labor job and we had a bad back and we had to take a shot for the day so we could go do our job, we'd take the shot, we go do our job because we have to have the job. I don't see this as being any different. The stakes are much higher, in as much as the amount of money that we're working for, if you're an athlete, is significantly more than a day laborer. But the day laborer, if they don't go to work, they don't get paid. So they need a performance enhancing drug, quote unquote, to do that. Where my focus really is making the international system more in line with what we do in the United States with our major sports leagues in terms of having unionized labor and having collective bargaining. With those tools, athletes have some say in what it is that they want to have be allowed and not. And obviously there's going to be limitations in terms of what the ownership is going to allow them to do. But at the end of the day, it's got to be up to the athletes. As long as they're educated on what it is that they are potentially taking and putting in their body, it has to be their choice if they want to or not want to take it. And I don't agree with the premise of what the WADA does, which is if you get a first violation used to be, way back in the day, was really minimal. Like if you got popped at the Tour de France in the 80s, you would, for that day, you would be knocked all the way down to last place, and you would get like a 10-minute penalty on top of that if it was not more than that, whichever one was bigger. But now with WADA, initially it was a 2-year suspension for your first popping. Now it's 4 because they want to make sure you miss at least one Olympic cycle. So in that case, it's punishment beyond anything else. They just want to make sure that you're humiliated as much as possible. And if you take 4 years out of someone's career, that for most athletes, that's their career.
Yeah, that's the end of it. Well, I mean, it's if you look at like I'll use Olympic weightlifting for example. You know, if you look at like the physicality and just the appearance of Olympic weightlifters around the world in comparison to, you know, the American weightlifters, you know, Dave Spitz, who's our buddy at Cal Strength, trains a lot of, Olympic weightlifters. And he's like, I feel like USADA and these different groups that do the drug testing are like trying to catch their athletes. He goes, and then we go to these other countries where this guy hasn't been tested in 3 years. And, he performance enhanced all the way up to it. They cleaned him up just in time, just for a final test. So He goes, the problem is that the testing frequency is so off kilter that we get tested, every 2 months, and they're coming, they're knocking on your door at, 3 a.m. wherever you are. And he goes, these other guys don't get tested for years. So he's like, there's no chance for us. He's like, any guy that takes them is going to get popped. These guys are showing up after, being doped up for 3 years, and all of a sudden they clean up. They lose a few percentages off of their finals, but it's enough to win gold medal and to not even make us competent.
And that's the problem. I mean, you have WADA, which is the centralized organization, and then you have all of the individual national organizations. So ours is USADA, Russians is RUSADA. And it's up to those individual national organizations to actually maintain the anti-doping regulations that are set by WADA. Now, Russia says they're doing it, but we know not only are they not doing it, but they're actually actively allowing their athletes to cheat and then breaking into the bottles of urine, replacing it with fresh urine, closing up the bottles that are supposed to be tamper resistant, and then giving it to a WADA certified laboratory to test. So it's a joke across the board. China did the exact same thing. They've done it a number of times. There's other nations that will continue to do it. It's not a sustainable method of trying to, maintain athlete safety is the primary thing. If athletes have some level of unionization and representation, then they can make they can't make all their own rules, but at least they'll have a bargaining chip, for Christ's sake.
How does that
right
look?
Now?
Like how, you've mentioned the idea that, there needs to be some form of collective bargaining. These guys need to unionize. I wonder what that looks like. Is that like a global union where now all the athletes are in, because I mean, if you look at it from the NFL, right? So the NFL owners, fought this idea, and finally the players are able to get together and create the NFLPA. And now the NFLPA collectively bargains with the NFL, based upon the rights. I'm just wondering, how does that look for an international organization to create that form of union?
I think it would look very much the same. I think you would have, you have an international governing body for athletes in track. Same thing for swimming. And so you just have those athletes who are registered with the IAAF or whatever it's called now, World Athletics. They would then form the World Athletics, athlete union. And then where they would actually be based, that's going to be up to them. But the fact that we do it in this one country does not mean by any stretch that we can't do it internationally. I mean, the baseball union, the NBA, both of those have at least one team in another country, in Canada. So there is obviously for it to get done. It's not going to be that tremendously difficult in terms of the legalities of it, because we're talking about international work laws, effectively labor laws. And there are other examples of international workers unions that have nothing to do with athletics. I would follow the same patterns in which they were actually established. There's going to be a number of individuals who have a vested interest in preventing that from happening, because then they're going to have to share a piece of the pie that they don't want to have to share currently.
Sure.
And that's going to be the International Olympic Committee. Organization that's going to be standing in the way.
Well, I mean, we saw it in the NCAA. I mean, when I was in college, we were so far below the poverty line. It was incredible. Mm-hmm. It was like $750 a month. I mean, we like fighting for scraps. You couldn't have a job in this. I mean, it was it just got to the point where they were so egregious that all of a sudden now they sue, and this NIL deal comes up, and a lot of these guys in college are making more money than current NFL players. So, I mean, the comment is, for so long, the schools and these, the different, bowl games and we're not making any money. And then all of a sudden it comes out, and the fact that the money was there the whole time, they were just taking it all,
sure,
and really splitting the revenue with the players. And if they had actually gone back and just paid the players a decent stipend where we weren't living below the poverty line, probably this would have never have happened.
I think you're right. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure, because the again, you're saying now that the level of money that they're getting is so much higher than a stipend would ever be. And again, when you look at what's happening now, it's not all the players who are getting NIL money.
No,
it's only the best of the best.
The best of the best.
The vast majority of the athletes are still living subsistence from day to day.
I saw a guy driving around in an orange Lamborghini here in Austin, their quarterback. So, I mean, for the marquee players are making some pretty good money, but it's similar to the NFL. The NFL only gives medical benefits for 5 years after you retire. Mm-hmm. And when I was part of the NFLPA, one of the things I fought for every year was lifetime medical benefits, and they fought us tooth and nail. And I remember saying if you don't put lifetime medical benefits in, it's going to come back to bite you in the ass. And it did, where all of a sudden, you got the junior sales and these guys killing themselves. Sure. And if they had just put lifetime medical, because the problem is you run out and then these guys didn't have a way to necessarily treat themselves. And, right. Every other professional sport, Major League Baseball, you play one inning, one play, one hit. In Major League, you have lifetime medical benefits. So the fact
NFL is making significantly more money than MLB. So there's no justification for that over time. All they'd have to do is put that money, into a retirement fund of some kind that's going to grow at 6%, and they could cover athletes for an extended period of time. You could require athletes to put money into a pot that would then allow for them to have pension thereafter and medical benefits for the rest of their lives. There's a number of different creative ways that they want to do this. But again, it all comes down to money. I mean, the answer to all your questions, my friend, is money.
Well, that and also there's a really interesting perception from the NFL owners where, the players are pawns. They're whining little children. Mm-hmm. Once I'm done with you, you just need to go away and disappear, and go off to the island of misfit toys. So there's nothing the NFL hates more than ex-players coming back and griping about this stuff. And
sure.
One of the things that, like I said, one of the things I bitched at when I was at the NFLPA meetings was there needs to be lifetime medical. I mean, after 5 years when I retired, I was very fortunate to be able to go out and get insurance, but I know a lot of guys really struggle with that. And
sure.
A lot of pre-existing injuries. It's really an issue, and I feel like the NFL could have done a much better job. I mean, and you're not even talking about guys that weren't vested, because it's 3 years, 3 games to become vested. I mean, for vested guys, 5 years, that's all you get. And if you're unvested, no medical.
That's just rough. That's rough. I mean, especially if the reason that you left the game was because of injury.
Yeah.
Then you're guaranteed to need medical for the rest of your life thereafter in some form or fashion. Yeah. So again, that's the gross greed that I see as being prevalent in sports. And it's 10 times worse at the international level, because they're not getting paid anything unless they have some sort of sponsorship, particularly American athletes. They get a little bit of a stipend from the USOC, but by and large, they're working a job and they're trying to maintain their training routine. And they get no money for what it is that they do. Whereas in other countries, if you look back at this is going back to Iron Curtain times, but those Soviet athletes who they were in the military, but their primary occupation was to be a basketball player or a weightlifter. That's what they did for their training. So the level of support that other nations are willing to give versus what we're willing to give, it makes it very difficult for us to compete at the same level.
Do you think there would be a way that we could create? I mean, like I have a lot of friends that are Olympic athletes, have won gold medals, and it's always amazing to hear how little support that they have. And one of the guys, Adam Nelson, he went and didn't win gold. He was a shot putter, didn't win gold in Greece, and ended up kind of missing it. Then the guy gets tested positive, and they finally give him his gold medal, and he missed the entire. All the endorsements ceremony and everything.
Sure.
I mean, he the story he gets is 4 years later he gets a phone call and he ends up going and they end up sliding him the gold medal in like a restaurant at a Burger King at the airport. He's in the Burger King. The guy comes up, here's your gold medal, and walks away. And he's like, I missed out on huge endorsement deals by not being able to get the gold, and now here I am finally getting this thing. And it was he said it was bittersweet to say the least. If you look at a lot of the foreign countries, they have programs in place to help their athletes go on and, hopefully win and do well. But it doesn't seem so the case here in the US. I mean, why is that different here than in other places?
Because the only other place that the money would come from, aside from corporations, is going to be tax dollars. And I don't know that there's an appetite for people paying athletes to be in the Olympics. I'm not sure I would necessarily support that. But I mean, there's got to be some way that we can actually do this, even if it is going to be with corporate donations. The corporations who sponsor the Olympics make tons of cash off the Olympic athletes who are running or swimming or doing whatever. There's no reason but at the end, I mean, then you'd have to mandate that corporations give a certain amount of money to there being a pot for the USOC to give out to the athletes. And that's a sticky one. Other countries actually take revenue from their national coffers to put into an Olympic training center and to pay their athletes and keep them going for a 4-year cycle. We have enough money that we could do that, but the trillions of dollars of debt, I'm not sure that that's really an attractive option. So that's another one of those questions. I'm not really sure what the answer to that one is, but there's an obvious dichotomy between how we treat our athletes and how other countries treat theirs.
What do you think about the legal ramifications? Lance Armstrong goes on Oprah and opens up and, talks about, his pretty advanced drug protocols when his biggest sponsor is U.S. Postal. So a government agency is his largest sponsor. And now he was, had the most sophisticated drug doping protocol for it with the U.S. Entity, part of the government as his sponsor. So in a way, the U.S. government contributed to the most elaborate drug protocol that we'd ever seen to the most successful cyclist. So, I mean,
Sure.
I
think it was bad luck that a U.S. government agency was his primary sponsor. If it had been anybody else, then they could not have gone after him like they did. What they claimed was that.
Do you think they knew in any way?
Nah. The people who were in charge of actually doing the sponsorships for Lance Armstrong, in terms of whoever was in charge at the U.S. Postal Service who was doing that, I seriously doubt it. I mean, the vast majority of the spectators didn't know, but whether they knew or not, I'm not even sure is really the issue. They claimed that they were defrauded because he was cheating the entire time. So that's fraud as far as they were concerned. Yeah. My problem with it is that the earnings for the U.S. Postal Service during the 10-ish years that they were sponsoring this team clearly improved over that period of time. And a large part of that reason was because of Lance Armstrong and the U.S. Postal Service team. So it's difficult for you to claim fraud when you're also making a ton of cash in the back end from this guy who's cheating. So it was another means by which, like you're talking about, we're going to punish you for the sake of punishing you. We're going to make a big old example out of you. You can't make the claim that you lost money on this deal. You didn't. You made a ton of money. So it was disingenuous, to say the least, when they came after him for what they did. There was another $1 million that he had to give to Landis because he was the whistleblower. So that was part of the whistleblower lawsuit that was tied in with this other one. But the biggest place that he lost money was all the sponsors who walked away from him. Now, did the sponsors know? I'm betting they did. Nike had its own doping scandal in the early aughts with one of their track coaches who was doing lots of stuff that he knew were illegal. They knew what to look for in terms of differences in performance. The rest of them, it's hard to say. I suspect the Trek probably did, but there's no evidence to confirm that. But considering the U.S. Postal is a government agency, like you said, I think it's highly unlikely that they had any inkling that this was actually taking place. But the rest of them, if they didn't know, they should have known.
Do you think it changes anything? Or you think they were all making so much money they didn't care?
Oh, does it change anything? I think that you have an easy scapegoat. I mean, part of this I'm not going to feel too sorry for Lance about. I mean, he knew what he was doing. Well, he knew if he got caught, he was going to get hammered, and he did.
Why do you think he was so forthright with coming? I mean, he could have denied it to the very end, but then for him to come out on Oprah,
he couldn't have. If you take some time to read the USADA report that they released on that entire thing, it's long, but the quantity of evidence that they have is just overwhelming. There was no way for him to deny anything at that point. And the biggest thing was that his teammates had come forward and testified against him. And the biggest one being George Hincapie. And he just didn't have a choice. I mean, it was either testify or you're just going to be, lifelong banned. It's like we're going to give Lance. They didn't have much choice at that point.
So what really spurred that? I mean, was it the drug testing that they finally caught up with him, or was it somebody came forward?
Landis came forward.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the thing. Landis came forward and he spilled the beans on all of it. There had been, everybody says Lance Armstrong never failed a drug test. That's almost accurate. In 99, he did fail a drug test for cortisone. And so what they did was that his doctors backdated a prescription for a cortisol cream that had the exact same formulation as what he was injected. And the race organizers just rubber stamped it and said, that's fine. Because back then things were just a bit looser and it was only cortisol as opposed to it being EPO. But for the rest of his career, he did not pop as far as we know. And so, what finally did it, Landis was a big part of it. After Landis came out and sold out, I'm not going to say sold out. I mean, he did what he felt was right, and I don't necessarily have a problem with it because it puts us in a position now that we're educated on it. But once he started to spill the beans about his other teammates, then they were put in a position where they had to do the same. And it's just like going after a drug cartel. You start with the low-level dealers and you move your way to the top, and that's exactly what they did. What I think finally did it, the reason that Landis decided to open his mouth was because Lance stupidly came back in 2009 and 10. If he had stayed away, if he had just kept his damn mouth shut and stayed away, this never would have happened because he came back. Landis had already been out for 2 years because he popped at the end of the 2006 tour. And so right around this time, he's looking to Lance and saying, look, get me in your team. I need something. And Lance is like, dude, you're radioactive. I can't do anything with you. So he's like, all right, well, you're not going to help me? Well, then I'm going to burn down the whole damn house. And that's what he did. So it all comes down to that. But the hubris of Lance coming back for 2009 and 2010 is what caused that to happen in the first place. Had he not done that, it still probably would have come out, but it would have come out with his nuclear bomb that exploded in his face.
Damn. What do you think the future is of this? I mean, do you think, you make a very compelling case. Do you think that this changes anything, or do you see a pivot? I mean, I feel like there's so much money wrapped up into this whole kind of the umbrella of drug testing and trying to catch the athletes. And I honestly wonder if the fans and the people that are watching really give a shit. And I guess we'll know with Peter Thiel's deal with an undrug tested Olympics, or putting it out there.
The enhanced games.
Yeah, the enhanced games.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that are going to happen. And one of them is there's a level of complacency, particularly amongst American fans. Like, I mean, if you look at Garoppolo is his first 4 games he's going to miss next season because he failed a drug test.
Oh yeah.
Did anybody really give a shit about that?
No. I feel like the only time people care is some clandestine Instagram handle who probably comments on there and calls him a cheater, and but who really gives a shit?
But again, in reality, if I'm not sure what it was that he was taking, they don't tell you that unless he wants to say it. But from reading through what was going on, it sounded like he was trying to recover from an injury. So is he really performance enhancing? Probably not. The vast majority of American sports fans at this point, they just don't care. They don't want to hear about it anymore. They just want to see the product on the field. And that same attitude is permeating throughout athletics across the globe. And now we have so this is progressed to the point where we're going to have in 2025 the first enhanced games. If nothing else changes, then what I think is probably going to happen is that at the very least, athletes are going to get paid for their performances at the Olympics, which is something that's a long time coming and should have happened ages ago.
Yeah.
It's akin to what happened with Live Golf and the PGA.
Yeah.
Live Golf pumps in a bunch of this money because the athletes themselves were agitating for bigger prizes at the PGA Tour events. They weren't getting it. So then Live said, okay, well, there's a market for us to come in here and do this. They scoop up all these athletes. And then what's the PGA's immediate response? They start to increase the purses. Yeah. So when you have a situation like this, it may not be something where the enhanced games actually gets locked in and is going to be a parallel games to the Olympics for the rest of time. But at least in the short term, you're going to force the Olympics into a position where they're going to have to make some changes. Now, do they allow athletes to take more drugs? I simply don't know. What I'm more interested in, again, I'll come back to the same idea. I want athlete representation. I want more athlete control, and I want athletes to stop being exploited.
Do you, I mean, we can't necessarily argue about the safety of the drugs, because I feel like for a lot of performance enhancing drugs, it's kind of a dose related, like for TRT, a dose of a cc a week for most people. But then now all of a sudden you see pro bodybuilders that are doing, 3 grams a week. And it's really kind of a dose dependent deal where, if the doses are moderate and kind of therapeutic, but then the problem is if there's an idea that 1 is good, 10 is better. And that's when you start getting into this whole deal. So I wonder if they're like, and that's human nature, right? If, I took a cc of this, and if I take a gram a week. I remember when I went out to go train out at Westside, Louis Simmons invited me out when they were trying to put a certification and asked me if I'd come out and train with them. So I was out there for 3 weeks, and I remember talking to Louis a little bit about their drug protocol, and his deal was whatever you want to total is what you have to base in testosterone a week. So if you're trying to total 3,000, it's 3 grams a week. And I was like just trying to do the math. I'm like, how do you get that much in you? And
it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. But I mean, those guys were taking a ton of drugs, and it was just part of their protocol and what they had to say. But I just kept thinking, like, as you see these guys that are, walking around probably a hermetic kit of 100, beat face, they look like walking heart attacks, that there's probably, very kind of moderate dosages for these drugs. And, like I said, in moderate amounts where it's, therapeutic. But then the problem is you're going to get people on this other side. So I wonder how you kind of balance that piece between, I'm going to take this and I'm going to die in 2 years, opposed from like, I'm going to maximize performance and still maintain some health on the other side.
You're going to have athletes going to be across the spectrum. I mean, that's just human behavior. And as we, throughout history, it's very difficult to legislate or regulate human behavior or human morality. You're going to have a lot of athletes who are going to be working with scientists, doctors, trainers, who are going to be able to figure out and optimize what is the doses that you need to actually work at your highest level before we start getting diminishing returns coming back the other side. And then you're going to have athletes who don't have enough money to pay those types of trainers and doctors, and they're going to be just kind of freewheeling it. And it's not going to be any different than any other aspect of society. Over the long term, the arc is going to bend towards doing things in a moderate way to get you optimized at your best level. And so the initial part is going to be really messy, and there's going to be messy spikes here and there. But on the whole, things will actually optimize out to a place where things will be level. It's no different than periodized training. We know that if all you do is pound, and never recover, you don't really get the gains that you would get otherwise, because it's during the recovery that you actually allow for your body to hypercompensate. The same thing is going to be true here. You're going to have to cycle on, cycle off, cycle on, cycle off. And if all you do is progressively increase the amount of doses that you're giving yourself, your body's going to give out. In some form or fashion, it's going to give out. Now, are we putting people in a position where they're going to be sacrificial lambs as guinea pigs for the rest of us? To some degree, yes. And that is just that's part of learning on this level. The primary problem that we have with the vast majority of these drugs is that these research studies have not been done because they've been considered unethical, and to some degree they are. But I mean, we can certainly do animal studies and see some of these things and then test them on ourselves. But there has not been an appetite to do this because to date, from the 1960s until very recently, everything has been about punishment and prevention, as opposed to actually building of knowledge. How do these drugs actually impact athletic performance? I'd say 80% of the drugs that are on the banned substances list probably have no impact at all on athletic performance. None. It's just wives' tales. It's only going to be a small percentage of very effective drugs that will actively enhance athletic performance. And so we have this huge laundry list of things that you can't take. Whether they have an impact or not, we don't know. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to make sure that it's on that list.
And in amounts that are so minuscule that
they would have an impact anyway.
Yeah, that are these trace amounts.
Exactly. And so that, therein lies another part of it. The tests have become so remarkably sensitive that they can catch people who have been, well, I mean, I'm sure they can catch some people who have been cheating, but they also catch people who have eaten things or drunk things that are contaminated. So much so to the point where there are at least 2 documented cases by USADA of athletes, female athletes, who tested positive for a banned substance, and then later were able to come back and show that they got that substance into their body after having sex with their partner. Now, that's lucky that they were able to do that and not lose their competitive status, but that's so invasive in terms of your privacy. What if that person was a one-night stand? What if you were cheating? What if you haven't come out as gay heterosexually and then you contaminate because you had sex? These are these remarkable things that people shouldn't have to deal with just because they want to be athletes.
Man. Dude, it's a massive question, and I really appreciate that you wrote the book. I mean, it makes it. I don't know. I go back and forth. Like, I understand, and the one argument you'll hear, made, and this comes from baseball especially, where people are obsessed with baseball statistics, and they want to be able to compare the Babe Ruths of the day to these guys, and they look at over the time of professional sports to be able to compare athletes to athletes from different generations. So the idea of and I know you said that they didn't necessarily scratch out any of the stuff from the McGuire when the ball and the players were juiced.
They didn't,
but none of those guys are going to get into the Hall of Fame. There's no way Barry Bonds gets into the Hall of Fame, and that's their kind of last little bit. Pete Rose will never make it into the Hall of Fame. I think he should. He never bet against his team. He only bet on his team to win, which I just think just shows incredible balls and a lot of confidence in who he is.
I agree with you. I think Pete Rose should be in. I think that Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa and Bonds should be in as well. They didn't expunge those records from the record book, but it's not just there where you see an issue with uneven levels in terms of even games played. I mean, it used to be 154. It went to 162 in 1962 because they had expansion teams that were coming in and they had to level out the schedule. Initially, the Maris record was going to have an asterisk by it. It was eventually removed. But, even now with the NFL, we went from 16 to 17 games. Prior to that, it was 14 games. So these rushing records, all the other statistics are being compared to a longer season, and we don't make any qualms about it. So why do we care if it's going to be a difference because of performance-enhancing drugs, or if it's going to be a difference because we have better nutrition, less travel, better sleep? I could go on and on. The playing field of today is remarkably different than it was during Babe Ruth's era. And the playing field of 7 years from now is going to be remarkably different than it is right now. So it's difficult to sit there and make those judgments about, comparing statistics from this era to that era to the next era. They're all different. Yeah. And they're all qualitatively different. And they each have their own respective highs and lows in terms of the good and the bad that they brought.
Well, cool. If people want to know more, I mean, obviously they can get the book on Amazon if you guys are interested. The book is called In Defense of Doping, Reassessing the Level Playing Field. So you guys can pick it up on Amazon. And if people want to get a hold of you and they want more information,
they can go to my website. So that is goodegg.fitness. And that's something I took from Moneyball. If you remember that movie at the end when he calls his buddy a good egg.
Yeah. No, that's another interesting movie. But cool. Well, Doc, thanks so much for coming on. It was an enlightening conversation, and I'm definitely a lot of things to think about. So thanks for tuning in.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Power Athlete Radio. See you. Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.